too. You imagine that what we're offering young people as a vision of the future is so unbearably toxic and counterproductive that they will choose to be diagnosed with a mental health disorder in preference to normality.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, obviously, but there's another problem, which is why are parents handing over their kids to therapists at the first indication of any problem? In fact, no matter how minor deviation from a benchmark, they go to diagnose and medicate. And the problem is, not only do we not know what goes on in that room, not only does the profession make no effort to track harmful effects of their interventions, unlike doctors who are mandated, to report side effects of their drugs. Not only is that going on, but we're seeing kids have these harms and there's no feedback mechanism. Anxiety is worse. Therapists don't track whether their treatments have made anxiety worse or depression worse for a kid. And we know therapy can do that. And we certainly know the therapeutic interventions, the focus on feelings constantly ruminating on sad moments in your life, the way they're asked to in school. All of that is very bad for mental health. And constantly questioning everything you're going to do before you do it. All of these are the opposite of what we would want young people to do. And that's what therapeutic schooling efforts have done, parenting efforts have done, and actual therapists have done. And I'll say, the last thing is that, parents' unwillingness to assert their authority authority in their homes has been a disaster because it let therapists in the door to be that authority. And unfortunately, unlike parents, therapists are incentivized to keep the least sick coming back for the longest period of time.
Well, I'm going to defend parents for a moment because,
Sure.
I'd like to shed light on why they do that. I mean, the narcissistic, compassionate types, so they're the ones that tilt towards borderline personality disorder, let's say. So we know maybe that about half the mothers of daughters who have rapid onset gender dysphoria and who move forward with therapy and treatment, up to half of them are diagnosable with something like borderline personality disorder. That's a big problem. So one of the characteristics of people with borderline personality disorder is that they will manipulate other people in any way that you could possibly imagine to gain attention for themselves. And if that means sacrificing their children to their pretensions of compassion, that's no problem at all. Now, if you're in a relationship with someone like that, the probability that you're going to be able to withstand that pressure, especially when the system itself has its guns aimed on you, and if you do stand up and say, I don't think my child should be heading in that direction, that you're going to be pilloried as uncaring and as a victimizer. And then it's even worse because the bloody therapists, and this is where I'm most appalled about my colleagues who've accepted this claim emanating from the worst of the psychopaths that, would you rather have a live trans child or a dead child? Now, I tell you, man, there's not a parent, an ordinary parent, like a non-psychologically trained parent on the planet, who, when faced with that accusation by a physician or a psychologist, isn't going to fold. Say, oh my God, this is worse than I thought. There's some risk that my child will commit suicide. And if I don't get on board with this in every possible way, and something terrible happens, it's going to be laid at my feet. And then if the accusations of being uncaring and victimizing are going along with that, well, it's just... And then the other thing too that's happening, Abigail, is that parents just can't believe these things are happening in their schools. Like I'm seeing this in Canada. I know Canadians are so asleep that it's kind of miracle. And I've tried to think that through. It's like, okay, how can people be so bloody blind? And then I think, okay, you can stay blind and assume that it's still 1990. So roughly speaking, the political parties do what they say they'll do and they're trustworthy. The legacy media isn't lying all the time. The educational institutions aren't completely corrupt. The judiciary is still intact. The legal system hasn't twisted itself into knots. Or you can dismiss all that as some sort of right-wing conspiratorial thinking and continue along your merry path. And if the price you pay for that is that the psychopathic teachers get their claws in your child, by the time you figure that out, it's going to be a bit too late. And I'm really seeing this especially in Canada. It's like people, even if you bring these things to their attention, they think, and I can understand this, they think there's no way things can be that bad. You have to be imagining it. And now and then I've stepped back and thought, well, Jesus, I did get harassed by my university and my governing board, which is still going on. And so maybe I've got more paranoid than I should be, and then I see what happened in Washington, D.C. with the presidents of UPenn, MIT, and Harvard. And I think, oh no, I saw this 7 years ago, as clear as a bell. And it's worse even than I think. And certainly it's making itself manifest in this pathological therapeutic environment, right? Now, you said something very interesting too. Here's something cool. So if you do statistical analysis, you can group the statements that people make about themselves into categories. And so one category is negative emotion. And so if you're high in the trait of negative emotion, be associated with depression and anxiety, you feel more shame and more guilt, more anxiety and more depression. Self-referential statements of all kinds load with neuroticism. Okay, this is an unbelievably important discovery. They load so completely that the personality test used for assessing neuroticism, the most common one, the NEO-PIR, has self-consciousness as a subset of neuroticism. So that means there's no difference between being self-conscious and being depressed and anxious. They're not linked. They're the same thing. So now you go to therapy, and the half-wit therapist does nothing but make you self-conscious. Right. Well, why does so? And the implication is,
and your teachers in school do the same thing.
Yeah,
your teachers guide you in social emotional learning. They do emotions check-ins. They are constantly asking you, how are you feeling? It is the best way to induce depression and anxiety in kids. And that's what they're doing nonstop. And unfortunately, parents are not only handing over their kids to these people, but they're doing it themselves. They're constantly checking in. They're letting therapists guide their parenting instead of taking the reins back and doing what we know works better with kids. Number one is parental authority, which of course doesn't mean being cold. It doesn't mean being cruel. It just means that the parents make the rules for the house, not some therapist.
Well, we could. So this also speaks to the issue of paucity of identity, and I've been trying to take this apart because I'm so embarrassed about the clinical enterprise now. And I thought, our whole notion of mental health is actually, it's corrupt. And the reason for that is that we think mental health is mental. It's inside, it's subjective, right? And if you're healthy, it's because you're self-actualizing, right? And if you're unhappy, it's because the self isn't properly organized as an interior structure. But the problem with that is, it's actually not true. And you can tell that's not true because you can't be happy in a miserable marriage. And the reason you can't be happy in a miserable marriage is because you're you, but you're also your married self. And then you're your married self plus your friendships and your business relationships and your ties to the broader community. And what psychological well-being is, it's not even the right term. What human well-being is proper situation in a hierarchy that includes the social environment. And so what that implies is that the more you think about yourself, the less you're focusing on how to establish solid, reliable, and reciprocal social relations, right? An intimate relationship, friendship, the bonds of a family, and then the less tightly wound binding that you have with the broader community. In the absence of all that, you concentrate on yourself. Well, not only you're miserable and depressed and anxious, you're also isolated, lonely, and insane. And that all stems from that initial presumption that all we would have to do is get your head straight and you'd be sane. It's like, and so you think, what does that also mean for the identity of kids? Because we should be teaching them, look, you're going to have to take your place in the world. You need a partner. You need some friends. You need an occupation. You need an educational plan. Like, you have to situate yourself in the world. None of that's relevant anymore. All that is oppression. It's no bloody wonder the kids choose a mental health diagnosis as the alternative to the normality that's nothing.
Well, what we did was we gave kids these incredibly unhealthy lives, as you said, these atomized lives. And we told them that they were so unique in the world and separable, and that was all that was important. And then we poured mental health resources into an incredibly unhealthy life. And then mental health experts pose as the solution to the unhappy life. Meanwhile, they've been participating the entire time in the idea that kids are weak, in the idea that they can't get through a car ride without an iPad, that they need to be told constantly that they are loved and that they are amazing at everything. They have guided everything in the wrong direction. They have provided nothing that we know to be good for making kids feel, actually achieve happiness. One of them is not focusing on your happiness and not making happiness your goal. Another thing is doing things for others in the world, feeling part of a social fabric. All those things that you said are so important. None of those have a role for a mental health expert, which is why the mental health experts took us in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Experts, yeah. Well, I watched the bloody social psychologists and the educational psychologists put forward psychological principles that were so appallingly misguided for decades. It was just painful to watch. So one of them, that emerged out of social psychology, which is a discipline with plenty of sins on its conscience. The whole self-esteem movement, to me, was just a jaw-dropping nightmare, watching that as a trained clinician. It's like, I see, so your presumption is that you can make kids feel good about themselves by celebrating non-achievements. That's your plan. And so that swept through the school system like mad. And so that was just, as Jean Twenge has pointed out, that was just a pathway. It was really what they were doing, Abigail, was they were instructing children in how to be narcissistic. And that narcissism was confused with self-esteem, right? And what's really strange, this is quite interesting. So technically speaking, if you look at self-esteem scales, there's actually no difference between them and scales of negative emotion. It's a false construct. So if you have low self-esteem, which is not something that technically exists, it's no different than being depressed and anxious. And you don't lift people out of depression and anxiety by making them narcissistic, which is what the social psychologists recommended, and then the educational psychologists. Okay, then they foster this dependency that you described so that children can't even go out of their bloody house without asking for permission, right? Every important decision has to be made with guidance, right? So they're fostering dependency like a devouring mother. So they're teaching narcissism, they're fostering dependence. Then they implement this whole culture of trigger warning and protection, which is exactly the opposite of what you would do if you were an actual, credible therapist. Because what you do to make people less anxious is find out what they're afraid of and then expose them in graduated doses to what they're afraid of. You don't say, well, you're a victim and now you have to be protected from everything. What you do if you do that is you make them worse. So Lukianoff has claimed, and I think he's exactly right, is that if the therapeutic community, the educational psychologists and the social psychologists, the social workers, all included, had set out to design a course of action to make children as mentally unstable as possible, and they used the proper behavioral techniques to do so, we would have ended up in exactly the situation we're in right now. Teach them to be narcissistic, teach them to be, and destroy merit at the same time, teach them to be dependent, shelter them from everything, and have them focus in a never-ending process on their own feelings. Right. It's so diabolical that, well, it's the sort of thing that, drives you down conspiratorial webs. I can't believe it's happened. It's jaw-dropping. So what have you seen as the manifestations of this? What have you been writing about specifically in your new book?
So to take one example, I interviewed a woman I've known for a long time who runs a major, named Evelyn, I call her Evelyn in the book, who runs a major cellular biology lab at one of our nation's premier research institutions. And she tells me that the kids she's seeing, aside from all their the anxiety and depression, and the fact that they constantly in the last decade update her on their mental health regularly. That's not something she's ever asked for, but they now give her updates. But the other thing is they're afraid to try. For the first time, even the most qualified kids with strong scientific backgrounds are afraid to make a move without checking with her, and they're afraid to do anything on their own. Things that kids with less ability, less scientific grounding ought to be able to go for it. They can't go for it. Their sense of agency has been eroded. That's not from social media, okay? That's not from smartphones entirely, if at all. It's from an idea that it's treatment dependency. I have to check with an adult or expert before I do anything. That's what our young adults now think. And I do think that our therapeutic era and our therapeutic so-called experts have taught them this.